Moscow, November 1952. In the Kremlin's medical directorate, a file is being compiled. It contains documents, reports, testimonies extracted under interrogation, and a name that, until recently, represented the pinnacle of Soviet medical achievement. The name belongs to Vladimir Nikanorovich Vinogradov, one of the most distinguished physicians in the Soviet Union, a man who had spent decades treating the highest levels of Soviet leadership. A doctor whose professional reputation was unimpeachable, whose expertise in cardiology and internal medicine was recognized across the country. The file also contains a confession. Whether that confession represents anything resembling the truth is a question that will take months to answer, and by the time the answer comes, it will come too late for the men whose lives are being destroyed in the building of it. Vinogradov is under arrest. His colleagues are under arrest or under investigation. The entire apparatus of Kremlin medicine, the network of physicians who treated the Soviet leadership, is being consumed by an accusation so enormous, so paranoid, so perfectly calibrated to Stalin's specific fears that it will reshape the final months of Soviet history. This is the story of the doctor's plot, the last great political fabrication of the Stalin era. And at its center, as both its most prominent victim and its most historically significant figure, stands Vladimir Vinogradov, the physician who knew too much about the health of the most powerful man in the world, and who paid for that knowledge with his freedom and nearly his life. To understand what happened to Vinogradov and why, we need to understand the world he inhabited, the specific position occupied by physicians who treated the Soviet elite, and the particular dangers that came with knowing the physical vulnerabilities of men who ruled through the projection of invincibility. Vladimir Vinogradov was born in 1882, making him 70 years old at the time of his arrest, a distinguished elder statesman of Soviet medicine. He had built his career across both the Tsarist and Soviet periods, surviving the Revolution, the Civil War, the collectivization, the purges, and the Second World War, his medical reputation allowing him a kind of professional continuity that was denied to most Soviet citizens. Medicine was one of the few fields where genuine expertise could provide some insulation from political turbulence, because the need for competent physicians transcended political considerations in ways that the need for competent engineers or historians or party officials did not. By the late 1940s, Vinogradov was the leading figure in Soviet internal medicine, head of the Department of Therapeutics at the First Moscow Medical Institute, a full member of the Academy of Medical Sciences, and the recipient of multiple Stalin Prizes, the highest honors the Soviet state could bestow on a civilian. He had treated virtually every senior figure in the Soviet leadership at one point or another. His patient list read like a directory of Soviet power. Most significantly, he had been Stalin's personal physician. This was the role that placed him at the intersection of medicine and politics in the most dangerous possible way. Treating Stalin required not just medical competence, but a kind of political navigation that had nothing to do with medical training. You had to be honest enough to provide useful medical advice, while being careful enough not to give Stalin information about his own health that would frighten or anger him. You had to recommend treatments while understanding that Stalin might reject them. You had to maintain the confidence of a man who trusted almost no one while working in an environment where every interaction was potentially being monitored and reported. Vinogradov had occupied this position for years, navigating its complexities with the careful professionalism of a man who understood both the medical and political dimensions of his work. He knew Stalin's medical history in detail. He knew that Stalin's cardiovascular health was a serious concern, that his blood pressure was dangerously elevated, that his arteriosclerosis was advancing. He had recommended treatments and lifestyle modifications that Stalin largely ignored, because Stalin, like many powerful men, found it easier to dismiss medical advice than to confront his own physical vulnerability. This knowledge, the detailed clinical picture of Stalin's health, was itself a form of power and a form of danger. In a system built on the projection of Stalin's invincibility, any physician who knew the truth of his physical deterioration was a potential threat to the mythology. If the general secretary was seriously ill, if his health was declining in ways that would limit his capacity to rule, that information was of enormous political significance to every person in the Soviet leadership who was calculating their position in a post-Stalin landscape. The atmosphere in which Vinogradov and his colleagues worked in the early 1950s was already saturated with a particular quality of fear that was different from the more generalized terror of the 1930s. Stalin was 72 years old in 1951, visibly aging, increasingly erratic, prone to extended periods of isolation at Kuntsevo, and increasingly unpredictable in his political judgments. The people around him were constantly trying to read his intentions, to anticipate his next move, to position themselves advantageously for whatever came next. Into this environment came a specific catalyst that would transform the anxieties of Stalin's final years into something operationally terrifying. In 1951, a document reached Stalin from Lydia Timashuk, a physician who worked in the Kremlin medical system, in which she alleged that senior Kremlin doctors, including Vinogradov, had deliberately provided incorrect treatment to Andrei Zhdanov, the Leningrad party leader who had died in 1948. She claimed that the doctors had misdiagnosed Zhdanov's condition, specifically that they had failed to correctly identify a myocardial infarction, and that this misdiagnosis had contributed to his death. Whether Timashuk made these allegations from genuine medical conviction, from personal grievance, from ideological motivation, or in response to prompting from figures in the security apparatus who wanted to build a case against the Kremlin doctors, is a question that historians have examined extensively without reaching definitive conclusions. What is established is that her letter eventually reached Stalin, and that it connected with something deep in his paranoid psychology. Stalin had always feared poison, had always maintained elaborate food testing procedures, had always been suspicious of those responsible for his physical care. The idea that physicians might use their access to harm rather than heal was not an original concern in his mind. What Timashuk's allegations provided was a specific, named accusation that could be investigated, developed, and expanded into the kind of conspiracy narrative that Stalin's political operations had always required. The investigation of the Kremlin doctors that began in late 1951 and accelerated through 1952 was conducted by the MGB under the direction of Stalin and with the involvement of figures whose motivations were multiple and not entirely convergent. Viktor Abakumov, who had headed the MGB since 1946, was actually himself arrested in 1951 on charges partly connected to his alleged slow walking of the investigation into the Kremlin doctors. His removal and replacement with Semyon Ignatieff accelerated the investigation and placed it in the hands of someone more willing to produce the results Stalin wanted. The results Stalin wanted were confessions. Confessions from senior Kremlin physicians admitting that they had been recruited by foreign intelligence services, specifically American intelligence operating through Jewish charitable organizations, to murder Soviet leaders through deliberate medical malpractice. It was an accusation of almost Baroque complexity, combining anti-Semitism, Cold War paranoia, and the specific logic of Stalin's conspiratorial worldview into a single narrative that could be used for multiple political purposes simultaneously. The anti-Semitic dimension of the doctor's plot was not incidental. Many of the physicians accused, though not all, were Jewish, and the campaign was explicitly framed in the public announcement of January 1953 as involving connections to American Zionist organizations. This framing connected the doctor's plot to the broader anti-cosmopolitan campaign that Stalin had been conducting since the late 1940s, targeting Jewish cultural figures, artists, writers, and intellectuals in a wave of persecution that had already claimed many lives and careers. Vladimir Vinogradov was not Jewish, which made his inclusion in the accusations significant in a different way. He was among the most prominent non-Jewish physicians arrested, his inclusion serving to demonstrate that the conspiracy was not simply an anti-Semitic operation, but a genuine security threat that had penetrated even beyond the ethnic group primarily targeted. His prominence, his decades of service, his Stalin prizes, all of it made his arrest more shocking and more politically useful than the arrest of less distinguished figures. He was arrested in November 1952. The specific circumstances of his arrest followed the standard NKVD procedure that had processed thousands of victims over 3 decades. The early morning visit, the search of his apartment, the confiscation of documents and personal items, the journey to Lefortovo prison, or one of the other detention facilities used for high-profile cases. He was 60 years old, a distinguished physician with no history of political activity, a man whose entire career had been devoted to medicine. What happened to Vinogradov in the months between his arrest and Stalin's death is documented in broad outline, but not in complete detail. The interrogation methods used on the Kremlin doctors were described by survivors after Stalin's death and confirmed by documents that became accessible in later decades. Physical coercion was used. Stalin had explicitly authorized the use of physical methods on the arrested physicians, overriding the hesitation of investigators who apparently thought that beating elderly, distinguished doctors might attract attention or produce unreliable confessions. Stalin's response, documented in communications from this period, was that physical methods should be applied without restraint. Vinogradov, under interrogation, eventually provided a confession. The precise content of what he confessed, which accusations he admitted, which names he provided, which elements of the conspiracy narrative he was made to confirm, is known in outline from the investigation materials that survived and were examined after Stalin's death. The confession was, like all confessions extracted under such conditions, a combination of whatever the interrogators required and whatever the prisoner could construct that would satisfy them while somehow preserving some remnant of self. The doctor's plot was announced publicly on January 13, 1953, in Pravda, under the headline reporting the discovery of a group of saboteur doctors. The article named 9 physicians, including Vinogradov, and accused them of being agents of American and British intelligence who had deliberately killed Zhdanov and had been planning to kill other Soviet military leaders. The article described the conspiracy in terms calculated to produce maximum public alarm, presenting the accused as monsters disguised as healers, traitors who had used their access to the most vulnerable moments of their patients' lives to commit murder. The public reaction to the announcement was shaped by the entire preceding context of Soviet political life. Decades of show trials, decades of conspiracy accusations, decades of impossible confessions had trained the Soviet population to accept that enemies could be anywhere, that trusted figures could be revealed as traitors, that the party's vigilance was the only protection against the enemies that surrounded the Soviet state on every side. Many people believed the accusations. Many others were afraid to express skepticism. In Moscow's Jewish community, the announcement produced genuine terror, because the anti-Semitic dimension of the accusations was unmistakable, and the historical precedents for where such campaigns led were not abstract. Within the Soviet leadership, the reaction was more complex. Members of the Politburo, who observed Stalin closely during this period, reported that he seemed energized by the doctor's plot in a way that was alarming, that he was building towards something larger, that the physicians were not the real target, but rather the opening gambit in a purge that was intended to reach much further. Anastas Mikoyan, Nikita Khrushchev, and others who survived to write about this period all described a sense that Stalin was preparing an operation that would ultimately consume members of the Politburo itself, that the old man was constructing the architecture of another great terror. Beria, who was himself potentially in the crosshairs of whatever Stalin was building, was reported by multiple sources to have understood clearly that the doctor's plot was a preliminary to an attack on the leadership, possibly including himself. The details of how Beria processed this understanding, what calculations he made, what actions, if any, he took in response, are among the most sensitive and least fully documented aspects of the final months of Stalin's life. What is documented is the sequence of events in early March 1953. Stalin suffered a stroke on the night of March 1st to 2nd, collapsing at Kuntsevo while alone, and was not discovered until hours later. When medical help was finally called, the Kremlin physicians, who would normally have been summoned, were unavailable in the way that the investigation of the doctor's plot had made them unavailable. The senior doctors who knew Stalin's medical history best, who were most experienced in treating him, were under arrest or under investigation. The physicians who were eventually brought to treat Stalin were more junior figures, working without the accumulated clinical knowledge of their imprisoned colleagues. Whether the absence of the experienced Kremlin physicians affected the outcome of Stalin's medical crisis is a question that cannot be answered definitively. Medical historians who have examined the available information about Stalin's stroke and subsequent treatment have noted that the conditions of his care in the first critical hours were significantly suboptimal, though whether better care would have changed the outcome given the severity of the hemorrhage is uncertain. What is not uncertain is that the man most responsible for eliminating the experienced medical team that should have been available had eliminated them through a paranoid fabrication that served his political purposes, and then suffered the consequences of their absence when he actually needed them. Stalin died on March 5, 1953, and within hours of his death, the political landscape of the Soviet Union began to shift with remarkable speed. The doctor's plot, which had seemed just weeks earlier like the opening of an unstoppable new terror, suddenly became inconvenient to the people now competing for power. Beria moved quickly. On March 13, 1953, just 8 days after Stalin's death, Beria announced that the investigation of the Kremlin doctors had been based on falsified evidence and that the accused were innocent. He ordered their immediate release. The investigation was terminated. The charges were dropped. The physicians who had spent months in prison, who had been beaten into confessing to murders they hadn't committed and conspiracies that hadn't existed, were told they were free. Vladimir Vinogradov was released. He walked out of the prison where he had spent months being interrogated and tortured, returned to Moscow, and attempted to reconstruct something of his previous life. He was rehabilitated professionally, his titles and honors restored, his membership in the Academy of Medical Sciences reinstated. The Stalin prizes he had received before his arrest were not revoked, but rehabilitation in the formal sense and recovery in the human sense are different things. Vinogradov was 70 years old when he was released, physically marked by the months of imprisonment and interrogation. The experience of being arrested, accused of murdering his patients, tortured into confession, and then abruptly declared innocent when the political winds changed, leaving the entire episode as unexplained officially as it was traumatic personally, was not something that could simply be put aside. He continued to practice medicine and conduct research after his release, but on a reduced scale, with the understandable limitations of an elderly man who had been through a severe ordeal. He lived until 1964, dying at the age of 81, having outlived Stalin by 11 years and having witnessed the partial unraveling of the Stalinist system that had nearly consumed him. The other physicians arrested in the doctor's plot were similarly released and rehabilitated after Stalin's death. Several had died in custody during the investigation. The full human cost of the operation, in terms of lives destroyed, careers ended, families disrupted, and the broader wave of anti-Semitic persecution that the announcement had accelerated, was substantial and extended well beyond the 9 physicians named in the original Pravda article. Lydia Timashuk, whose letter had provided the initial spark for the investigation, had been awarded the Order of Lenin in January 1953 for her supposed role in exposing the conspiracy. After Stalin's death and the discrediting of the doctor's plot, the award was revoked. Her subsequent history is a minor footnote in the larger story, but it illustrates how completely the political reversals of March 1953 swept away everything the previous months had constructed. The doctor's plot has been analyzed by historians from multiple angles, and its significance extends beyond the immediate suffering of its victims. It was, in the context of Soviet political history, the clearest demonstration of how Stalin's system could manufacture political reality from nothing, could take a letter from a minor physician, combine it with existing paranoid fears, shape it into a national security emergency, and use it to justify the arrest and torture of distinguished citizens whose only crime was professional proximity to power. It demonstrated something else, too: the specific vulnerability of anyone who knew the truth about Stalin's health. Vinogradov had examined Stalin, had assessed his cardiovascular condition, had made recommendations about his care. He possessed clinical knowledge about the General Secretary's physical state that was potentially of enormous political significance. In the Soviet system, that knowledge was not simply private medical information. It was a state secret of the first order, and the physician who possessed it was, by that fact alone, a security risk. The logic was insane but perfectly consistent with the Soviet system's internal coherence. If Stalin was ill, that information was dangerous. The physician who knew was dangerous. Arresting the physician silenced a potential source of dangerous information. The fact that arresting the physician was also medically catastrophic, eliminating the person most qualified to treat Stalin if he became seriously ill, was a consequence that the system's logic did not and could not account for. This is the deepest irony of Vinogradov's story and of the doctor's plot as a whole. Stalin, in his paranoid campaign against the men responsible for his medical care, eliminated the most qualified people to treat him. When his stroke came, the experienced physicians who knew his history, who had treated him for years, who understood his specific medical profile, were unavailable. The man who had spent years worrying that his doctors might kill him had succeeded in removing them and then needed them. The system consumed the protection it had built against itself. The paranoia that was supposed to protect Stalin contributed to the conditions in which he died. It is not poetic justice, not in any clean sense, because the innocent people who were tortured and imprisoned in service of that paranoia were not restored to health and dignity by Stalin's death. They were simply released, their suffering acknowledged with the same bureaucratic efficiency with which it had been inflicted, and the whole episode was buried as quickly as possible by people who had various reasons to want it forgotten. Vladimir Vinogradov spent the years after his release in the strange suspended state of the rehabilitated victim, technically restored to good standing, actually carrying the weight of what had been done to him and the knowledge of why it had been done. He knew better than most people what the Soviet system was capable of, what its logic required, how completely it could reverse itself when political necessity demanded. He had been inside the machine and had come out the other side. What he thought about Stalin, about the system, about the years he had spent as Stalin's physician before his arrest, and the months he spent in prison afterward, is not fully documented. He did not write extensively about his experiences, at least not in materials that became publicly available. The Soviet culture of silence around such things was deeply embedded, and even after rehabilitation, speaking openly about what you had endured was not encouraged and was often actively dangerous. He practiced medicine. He taught. He continued contributing to the field that had defined his life. He died in 1964 in Moscow, having lived through one of the most extraordinary periods in human history, having stood closer to its center than almost anyone, and having survived it in the way that survival was defined in the Soviet Union, by continuing to breathe, by continuing to function, by carrying what you knew in silence, and finding in the work of medicine some continuity that the political storms had not managed to entirely destroy. The broader story of the doctor's plot did not end with the release of its victims. It continued as a historical question, examined and re-examined by scholars trying to understand what it revealed about Stalin's final years, about the succession struggle, about the relationship between the anti-Semitic campaigns of the late Stalin period and the institutional anti-Semitism that persisted in Soviet life for decades afterward. It continued as a political question in the Soviet Union and later in Russia, where the willingness to acknowledge the anti-Semitic dimension of the campaign, to confront honestly what the Soviet state had done to Jewish citizens in its final Stalinist years, was and remains complicated by the broader difficulties of honest historical reckoning with the Soviet period. And it continues as a human question, the question of what it does to a person to be trusted completely, to be given access to the most intimate knowledge of powerful people's physical vulnerability, to spend decades in that position of extraordinary professional responsibility, and then to be turned overnight into an enemy, a saboteur, a murderer, on the basis of nothing, on the basis of a system's need to find enemies, because without enemies the system could not sustain the fear on which it operated. Vinogradov's crime was being a physician who was good enough at his job to be trusted with the health of the Soviet leadership. His knowledge of that health, accumulated over years of professional service, was the crime for which he was punished. His expertise, the quality that had made him valuable, became the quality that made him dangerous, and therefore a target. That is the specific logic of the doctor's plot, and it is the specific logic of the Stalin system in its final, most paranoid form. The more valuable you were, the more dangerous you were. The more trusted, the more suspect. The closer to the center of power, the more completely exposed to its capacity for destruction. Vladimir Vinogradov treated Stalin's heart for years. In the end, what nearly destroyed him was that Stalin's heart could not be trusted.